Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day and the week on GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We're concluding today's show with a player who I feel is kind of going too under the radar, because when I think about this team right now and the current stage where it's at, I don't really know how this offense is going to look this year. It's always been kind of a run-heavier system and setup, but with a new head coach and a new quarterback, this team certainly profiles as one to definitely keep your eye on as this offense progresses. And this guy can certainly be a huge part of that offensive setup. Let's talk about the fantasy player profile of Donovan Edwards. Now, when I talk about a guy like Donovan Edwards, a lot of people might be saying I'm over-exaggerating some of the games that Donovan Edwards has had, where he truly has shown that he has the potential to be one of the best running backs in college football. But when I think about him, when I think about what he meant to the system, even with Blake Corum still in it, even with J.J. McCarthy still in it, Donovan Edwards really finding the places to cement himself as someone who this Michigan offense can trust for the next couple of years really speaks to what he meant the system. The fact that he really could have transferred out this year because of the question mark surrounding this look of this offense. And he stuck around, the fact that he learned under Blake Corum, the fact that he's had good games, even better games than what Blake Corum could have had, shows that Donovan Edwards is not a fluke. And this guy I really admire because his best traits stem from the connectivity he has with his team. And it's going to be very important as they break in a new quarterback. Let's talk about him a little bit. He only had 499 yards last year and 5 touchdowns. He had 249 receiving yards, though. His best game was actually against Washington in the college football playoff final. 22 points, 2 TDs. I can't read my own writing. 6 carries, 104 yards. 4th most receiving yards at the running back position. And when I think about how this Michigan team profiles, right? Only one of their top 5 targets in terms of receiving returns, and that's Colston Loveland, of all players. And when I think about what this whole offense is going to look like this year, I certainly do not think that Sharon Moore wants whoever is the quarterback to throw the ball deep downfield. I certainly don't think Sharon Moore is going to go away from what had worked for Jim Harbaugh in the past. And in all honesty, if you want my humble opinion, Donovan Edwards is an exponentially better player than anyone on this offense, and here's why. The prospective starting quarterback for the Michigan Wolverines is a guy named Alex Orji. Alex Orji has had a couple snaps. In fact, he had a couple snaps actually in the CFP semifinal, so he's had some game time experience. But I believe only 1 or 2 of those snaps on the field resulted in throws. This is a guy who, if you saw some of the snaps, who took the snap from under center more like a running back, like a direct snap, and ran the football. If that's the quarterback who Michigan is going to go with, you're going to need a dynamic running back to counteract that, because you're not going to get that much chunk yardage from that. That's something I will give J.J. McCarthy. J.J. McCarthy always knew when and how to run. That was something that he really brought to this offense, and that's what really brought out the run game as well. There were so many different ways that you had to defend it that you could do anything if you were Michigan in terms of the running game. And if it's Alex Orji who's the quarterback, does Michigan really want to trust him in terms of opening up the passing game? Or do they want to stick with the narrative they've always done with? And so, when I look at Donovan Edwards, and I look at the games that he's had in good situations and good setups, I think that going forward, you need that explosivity in this offense, even if it doesn't always pan out into big games and big results. And here's the thing. Michigan right now doesn't need to be a team that wants to play like a defending championship. They definitely have the profile of a team that could compete, but there are just too many question marks right now. I think Sharon Moore needs to really decipher the ways he can build this team through his decisions. And I think that if he decides to pick Alex Orji, it's the most kind of safe pick, because Alex Orji is very similar traits to J.J. McCarthy and what he brought. He's not going to really pass the ball vertically, but he is going to keep this team on schedule. And so that's what I want out of Michigan. That kind of continuation of the narrative, saying that they're not going to change for anyone, really goes to show that anyone on this team can really step up. And while it certainly seems like you might want to kind of get into the passing game, I don't necessarily think that as of this moment Michigan is well equipped. Maybe in a couple years down the road they'll find some nice receivers, whether it be through the transfer portal, whether it be through recruiting, and they can become an entirely different team. But as of right now, when I look at the Michigan Wolverines, I look at a team that has built its identity, its championship culture, the championship culture that it took to get them to that point where they finally broke through and won the CFP. It was a power running game that really predicated itself on physicality, grit, and toughness. And when I think of all the players on this Michigan offense, no one is more tough than Donovan Edwards. And when I think about the security he brings to that backfield, the soundness he brings to when Alex Orji might be having trouble in a game, I think that this guy can truly be a fascinating fantasy asset to you. I've talked about both Quinn Judkins and Ollie Gordon. So what separates them is that they're just explosive running backs who play for drastically different teams, but in many different ways have space to make themselves names. For Donovan Edwards, it was just the whole time he was sitting behind the great Blake Corum. And when the opportunities arose, he took them in stride. And he took them in big moments as well. And that's what matters to me as well. If he had done this in garbage time against, say, a Ball State or a team that Michigan plays in its non-conference slate, I would have said, Donovan Edwards is not someone I will talk about. He's someone who I don't think will really help this Michigan offense this year. But he did this in the CFP semifinal 2 years ago against TCU, and he did it in the CFP final to win the championship this year. Those two games really set apart, in my mind, the difference between a Donovan Edwards who could be seen as a detriment to this team, a stagnative point in the setup, and the difference between him becoming a star. And right now, there are very few stars in this Michigan offense. If anything, I don't think that Michigan wants to have stars, but the closest thing to it is this guy Edwards. And if Sharon Moore wants to continue the narrative that Jim Harbaugh has placed for him, I think that he goes forward with Donovan Edwards as the centerpiece of this offense. Now, Donovan Edwards isn't going to be here forever, right? He's not going to be a player who's going to be here and that Michigan will build around. But at the end of the day, if you're Michigan and you look at the ways you win and what winning means to you and your program, all roads lead through the run game. This year will look very different in the Big Ten for Michigan. It's going to face a lot of problems. It's going to hit a lot of running blocks. They face Texas in week 2, for God's sake. That's a fantastically difficult situation for them, even if it's at home. But if you shy away from what you built your program on, that's when teams will smell blood. You can stick with the power running game and it will not work. And that's okay. You have to accept that eventually along the line, teams will figure it out. That's the thing. Nobody's figured it out yet. You have to use that to your advantage for as long as you're not going to throw the ball on the field. That's the advantage Michigan has over everybody. Even though they're perhaps the weakest defending national champion in recent memory. What they have going for them is that even in what seems like a time of turmoil, they have one player who truly defines what this era of Michigan football is all about. And they have this continuity about them. No matter who is plugged into what position. That says to me that this team isn't necessarily going anywhere. They may not win the CFP this year again. They may not win for many years. Who knows? But for now, by sticking with what you know, it allows for Donovan Edwards to truly be seen in this national spotlight he deserves, and it truly cements him as perhaps the most intriguing of all fantasy players I named in today's show. Without him, I don't believe that Michigan would have had any iota of what to do, any modicum of an idea of what to do. But because of what he brings to the plate, you have to acknowledge the fact that he's a better asset than anyone in college football, if he truly is what I believe he can be. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you guys for tuning in all week. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm Chris Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever, maybe even live. Thank you guys for tuning in yet again.